A photograph that should never have been captured rests in the archives of a dilapidated Massachusetts courthouse, buried beneath forgotten paperwork from decades past. In it, two young boys in their finest attire pose solemnly next to what appears to be their slumbering brother. Yet, Herbert Prescott wasn't merely asleep. He had been dead for 3 days when this image was taken in November 1858. What the camera recorded, however, would later unveil one of the most troubling family secrets in American history, a bloodline so tainted by generations of inbreeding that death itself seemed uncertain about when to claim its victims. Hello, everyone. Before diving in, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the time you're tuning in. This helps YouTube keep suggesting stories like this one to you. The Prescott Hollow Enigma. The Prescott family arrived in Salem County, Massachusetts, in 1679, part of the wave of English settlers seeking fresh opportunities in the New World. But unlike many families who dispersed across the expanding frontier, the Prescotts remained isolated, clustered within a remote valley that locals eventually dubbed Prescott Hollow. Over the generations that followed, what began as a tight-knit family unit slowly evolved into something much more sinister. By the 1850s, the family tree had grown so convoluted that branches seemed to loop back into themselves. Marriage records from that era reveal a disturbing recurring pattern. Prescotts marrying other Prescotts, cousins wedding cousins, and uncles taking nieces as wives. The local church registry, preserved by the Salem Historical Society, documents a minimum of 14 marriages between direct blood relatives over a span of just 60 years. When clergymen visiting the Hollow questioned these unions, the family patriarch, Jeremiah Prescott, would simply state that Prescott blood must be kept pure. The physical consequences of this genetic isolation became increasingly evident with each passing generation. Children were born with misshapen limbs, webbed fingers, and minds that failed to fully develop. The family cemetery, secreted away deep within their private woods, holds dozens of small graves, marking children who survived for only weeks or days. Those who reached adulthood frequently displayed peculiar characteristics: an unusual pallor to their skin, eyes that appeared overly large for their faces, and a susceptibility to what the family termed the sleeping sickness. Herbert Prescott, born in 1842, was considered one of the fortunate ones. Unlike his younger siblings who perished in infancy, or his cousin Martha, who spent her days rocking in a chair conversing with unseen companions, Herbert seemed normal. He was articulate, intelligent, and showed no visible signs of the genetic damage that had afflicted his bloodline. His younger brother, George, 9 years his junior, looked up to Herbert as both a father figure and a protector, especially after their parents succumbed to what the family doctor tactfully called consumption of the blood. But the Prescott curse ran deeper than mere mental incapacity or visible deformities. Something in their corrupted bloodline had begun to impact the very essence of life itself, the blurred boundary between existence and death. Herbert would become the first officially recorded case of what modern geneticists now identify as a rare hereditary condition, capable of inducing cataleptic states so profound they flawlessly mimic death. The inbreeding hadn't just weakened their bodies. It had spawned a genetic anomaly that would trap Herbert between life and death in the most unimaginable, horrifying way. November 1858 brought an early winter to Prescott Hollow, and with it, a sense of foreboding that settled over the isolated homestead like a burial shroud. Herbert, now 16 and burdened with responsibilities far exceeding his years, had been having peculiar episodes for several weeks. He would suddenly freeze mid-sentence, his breathing becoming so shallow it was barely noticeable, his eyes staring blankly into space. These spells, which the family had learned to call Herbert's quiet times, could last anywhere from minutes to hours. George, only 9 but already aware of the family's dark secrets, had started keeping a rough diary of his brother's condition. In childish script, he recorded Herbert's increasingly frequent lapses. Herbert went quiet again today during breakfast. I counted to 300 before he blinked. His skin felt cold like the stones by the well. The young boy developed a ritual. He would desperately hold a small mirror beneath Herbert's nose during these episodes, watching for any sign of breath fogging the glass. The local physician, Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood, had been treating the Prescott family for over 2 decades. He understood their peculiarities and the critical need for discretion concerning their condition. His medical journals, discovered in 1923 when his practice was demolished, contain extensive observations of the family's hereditary afflictions. Regarding Herbert specifically, he noted, "The boy presents with episodes of profound catalepsy that appear to be increasing in both frequency and duration. I fear his bloodline has produced something unprecedented in medical literature." On the morning of November 14th, Herbert seemed to be in better spirits than he had been in weeks. He shared stories over breakfast, helped George with his morning chores, and even laughed at one of his younger brother's jokes. But as the afternoon progressed, a familiar glassiness crept into his eyes. George first noticed the change when Herbert's movements became mechanical, as though he was sleepwalking through his daily routine. By evening, Herbert had retired to his room, complaining of exhaustion. George brought him dinner on a tray, observing how his brother's hands trembled while he ate. "I feel strange tonight, George," Herbert confessed, his voice a bare whisper. "Like I'm watching myself from somewhere far away." Those would be the last coherent words Herbert Prescott ever spoke. When George checked on him the next morning, he found his brother perfectly still, eyes closed, face serene, and with no detectable signs of life. Dr. Blackwood arrived within the hour and conducted the most thorough examination possible, given the medical limitations of 1858. He checked for a pulse at various points, felt for breath using feathers and mirrors, and even pricked Herbert's skin with needles, all to no response. After nearly 3 hours of testing, he pronounced Herbert Prescott dead, although his private notes reveal significant disquiet. "I have declared death, though something about this case troubles me deeply. The body shows none of the usual signs of decay, and there is a quality to his stillness that seems expectant." 3 days after Herbert's supposed death, the family arranged for what would become one of the most haunting photographs in American history. Post-mortem photography was a common practice in the 1850s, especially for families who had lost young members. But the Prescott Commission would be unlike any other in photographer James Whitmore's 30-year career. Whitmore had established his reputation photographing the deceased across Massachusetts, perfecting techniques to make corpses appear peacefully at rest, surrounded by grieving relatives. He had witnessed death in all its forms: peaceful, sudden, prolonged, and violent. However, when he arrived at the Prescott homestead on that gray November morning, something about the scene he was asked to capture felt fundamentally wrong. Herbert had been placed in the family's ornate parlor chair, dressed in his best suit, with his younger brothers, Thomas and George, arranged beside him. The family had requested a remembrance portrait. They called it a final image to preserve Herbert's memory. But as Whitmore prepared his equipment, calculating exposure times and adjusting the heavy glass plates, he noticed details that defied his understanding of death. Herbert's skin still held a subtle warmth when Whitmore accidentally brushed his hand while positioning the chair. Even more unsettling was the faint color in Herbert's cheeks, not the waxy pallor of the dead, but something that suggested blood was still moving beneath the surface. Whitmore's notes from the session, preserved in his studio records, reveal his mounting unease. The deceased presents most unusually. "I have photographed hundreds of corpses, yet never have I encountered one that seemed so present. Several times during the lengthy exposure, I could swear I detected the slightest movement of his chest." Young George appeared almost hysterical during the session, constantly glancing and dancing at Herbert, as if anticipating him to suddenly sit up and speak. The boy's behavior was so erratic that Whitmore nearly canceled the sitting entirely. "The child keeps whispering to his brother," Whitmore wrote, as though carrying on a conversation with the dead. Most unsettling. What Whitmore could not have known was that George had been experiencing vivid dreams since Herbert's apparent death. Dreams where his brother cried out to him, begging for assistance, describing a terrible darkness where he couldn't speak or move, yet remained terrifyingly aware. The photographic process of 1858 demanded subjects remain perfectly still for several minutes while the image was captured on glass plates. Living subjects often struggle with this requirement, moving slightly and blurring the final image. Dead subjects naturally posed no such issue, but as Whitmore worked, he observed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Herbert's position had subtly shifted between exposures. It was barely noticeable, but Whitmore's trained eye caught the difference. In the first test exposure, Herbert's hands were folded neatly across his chest. In the second, final image, his fingers had slightly curved as though grasping for something. When Whitmore mentioned this to Dr. Blackwood, the physician dismissed it as post-mortem settling of the body. But privately, both men shared the same terrible suspicion, that Herbert Prescott might not be as dead as they had declared. The completed photograph would later become evidence in one of the most disturbing premature burial cases in American medical history. But in 1858, it served only as a memorial to a boy whose family's cursed bloodline had created something unprecedented in medical annals. Herbert Prescott was buried on November 18, 1858, for days after his apparent death, in a family cemetery hidden in the dark woods behind their homestead. The delay was longer than typical for the era, supposedly due to the time needed to prepare the ornate oak coffin the family had commissioned from a craftsman in nearby Salem. But George's diary entries from this period suggest a different reason for the postponement. The family was deeply divided about whether Herbert was truly deceased. The boy's crude, yet haunting entries reveal a household in psychological turmoil. Uncle Silas says Herbert looks too good to be dead. Aunt Prudence keeps checking his mirror for breath clouds. I asked Dr. Blackwood why Herbert's fingernails are still growing, and he told me not to ask such questions. Modern medical knowledge explains that nail and hair growth can continue for days following death. But in 1858, such phenomena only compounded the family's mounting dread. The burial itself was a modest affair, attended only by Dr. Blackwood and immediate family members. The Prescott family had always been secretive about their affairs, and generations of inbreeding had left them with few ties to the outside world. As the oak coffin was lowered into the rocky New England soil, George later wrote that he heard what sounded like muffled tapping from inside the wooden box. When he mentioned this to his uncle, he was warned never to speak of such things again and told it was merely the settling of Herbert's body. But George's nightmares were only just beginning. In the weeks after the burial, the boy experienced increasingly vivid dreams that felt more like visitations than typical sleep disturbances. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced he heard Herbert calling his name from somewhere deep underground. His diary entries from this time become increasingly frantic. Herbert came to me again last night. He was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand the words. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. He looked so frightened. Meanwhile, Dr. Blackwood was conducting his own investigation into the Prescott family's medical history. What he uncovered in family Bibles and church records appalled him. A genetic legacy so compromised by inbreeding that it had produced conditions he had never before encountered in medical literature. His private correspondence with colleagues at Harvard Medical School reveals his growing certainty that the family carried hereditary traits capable of causing states of suspended animation, indistinguishable from death by contemporary diagnostic methods. The local community began to whisper about strange occurrences in Prescott Hollow. Travelers reported hearing cries emanating from beneath the ground, though they attributed these to the wind rustling through the trees. Most disturbing of all, farm animals refused to graze in the fields near the family cemetery, and several residents claimed to have seen a figure matching Herbert's description walking through the woods at night, always moving toward the cemetery, only to vanish when approached. George's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would spend hours sitting by Herbert's grave, engaging in one-sided conversations with the earth. Family members found him one morning, his hands bloody from clawing at the frozen ground, insisting he could hear his brother scratching at the coffin lid from below. When Dr. Blackwood examined the boy, he noted symptoms of severe psychological trauma, but also wondered if George might be experiencing some form of psychic connection to his buried brother, a phenomenon later documented in cases involving twins and other close genetic relatives. If you're still with us, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. By the spring of 1859, George Prescott's condition had deteriorated to the extent that Dr. Blackwood feared for the boy's sanity. The child had stopped eating, barely slept, and spent most of his waking hours describing detailed conversations with his dead brother. But it was George's increasingly specific descriptions of Herbert's supposed underground experiences that finally persuaded the doctor to take a drastic measure. "Herbert says the wooden box is getting smaller," George told Dr. Blackwood during one of their sessions. "He says his fingers are bleeding from trying to push up the lid. He says he can hear us talking sometimes, especially when it rains and the water seeps down." These were not the vague imaginings of a grieving child. They contained details about burial practices and coffin construction that no 9-year-old should have known. Dr. Blackwood made the unprecedented decision to recommend exhumation. The family initially resisted, but George's deteriorating mental state and the doctor's persistent concerns about the unusual circumstances of Herbert's death eventually swayed them. On May 3, 1859, nearly 6 months after the burial, a small group consisting of Dr. Blackwood, several family members, and 2 local laborers gathered at Herbert's graveside with shovels and lanterns. What they discovered when the coffin was finally unearthed and opened would haunt every witness for the remainder of their lives. Dr. Blackwood's official report, preserved in the Massachusetts Medical Society archives, describes the scene in clinical terms that barely contain the horror they found. The deceased had clearly regained consciousness post-burial. Evidence of desperate struggle was immediately apparent. The interior of the coffin lid was gouged with deep scratches, clearly made by human fingernails. Splinters of wood were found embedded under what remained of Herbert's fingernails, and his hands were positioned above his head, pressed against the coffin lid in a final, futile attempt to escape. But perhaps most horrifying was Herbert's position inside the coffin. He had been buried lying peacefully on his back, arms crossed over his chest. When the coffin was opened, his body was contorted, knees drawn up, head twisted to one side, arms extended upward as though he had been pounding on the wooden barrier above him. The fabric of his burial suit was torn in several places, consistent with violent, thrashing movements. Most disturbing of all, Herbert's mouth was open in what appeared to be a silent scream, and his eyes, gently closed at burial, were wide with an expression of absolute terror. Dr. Blackwood noted in his report that the body displayed clear signs of asphyxiation, not the peaceful natural death they had originally diagnosed. George's reaction to these findings was immediate and shocking. Rather than the hysteria the adults expected, the boy became perfectly calm for the first time in months. "He's not calling to me anymore," George simply said, staring down at his brother's contorted remains. "He's finally quiet." The child's nightmares ceased immediately following the exhumation, but he would never fully recover from the psychological trauma of having unknowingly listened to his brother's underground death struggle for 6 months. Dr. Blackwood's investigation revealed that Herbert had likely regained consciousness within hours of being buried. The scratches on the coffin lid suggested he had fought for his freedom for days, possibly even weeks, before finally succumbing to dehydration and suffocation. The realization that they had condemned a living boy to one of the most horrific deaths imaginable would drive 2 of the family members present at the exhumation to take their own lives within the year. The Herbert Prescott case forced Dr. Blackwood to confront a medical reality that challenged everything he thought he knew about death itself. His subsequent research into the family's genetic history revealed a pattern of inbreeding so extensive that it had essentially created a new form of hereditary catalepsy. This was a condition where the victim could enter states of suspended animation so profound that they appeared clinically dead by the diagnostic standards of the 1850s. Working with colleagues at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Blackwood traced the Prescott bloodline back to its origins in Salem County. What he discovered was a family tree so twisted by generations of cousin marriages that the genetic pool had become catastrophically shallow. The original Prescott patriarch, Jeremiah, had married his own niece in 1695. Their children married each other and their cousins, creating a pattern of genetic isolation that persisted for over 160 years. The medical consequences of this inbreeding had manifested in various ways throughout the generations: stillbirths, mental deficiency, physical deformities, and unusual neurological conditions. But Herbert represented something unprecedented, a genetic anomaly that could trigger cataleptic states indistinguishable from death. Dr. Blackwood's research suggested that at least 3 other Prescott family members over the previous century had been buried after suspiciously sudden deaths with no apparent cause. In his landmark paper presented to the New England Medical Association in 1860, Dr. Blackwood described what he termed Prescott syndrome, a hereditary condition that could cause victims to enter states of such profound unconsciousness that pulse and breathing became virtually undetectable. Unlike normal catalepsy, which was well documented, this condition appeared to be triggered by illness or stress and could endure for days or even weeks. The paper included detailed analysis of the family's death records, birth certificates, and marriage records spanning 5 generations. The pattern was undeniable: a closed genetic system that had amplified rare neurological traits to the point where they became dominant characteristics. Dr. Blackwood theorized that the same genetic factors responsible for the family's various mental and physical abnormalities had also created a unique form of catalepsy that so completely mimicked death that even trained physicians could be deceived. Modern genetic analysis of preserved Prescott family records has since confirmed Dr. Blackwood's suspicions. The family carried multiple recessive genes that, when combined through inbreeding, could produce a rare neurological condition affecting the autonomic nervous system. This condition could slow the heart rate and breathing to almost imperceptible levels while maintaining basic brain function, essentially trapping the victim in a paralyzed but conscious state. What makes the Herbert Prescott case particularly tragic is that this condition was not necessarily fatal. With proper medical intervention, primarily ensuring adequate nutrition and breathing, victims could fully recover from cataleptic episodes. But in 1858, buried 6 feet underground in an airtight coffin, Herbert had no chance of survival. He died not from his genetic condition, but from the medical ignorance of his era. The psychological implications of Herbert's experience remain almost too horrifying to contemplate. Modern researchers estimate that he was likely conscious and aware for the entire duration of his underground imprisonment. He would have fully understood what had happened, known that he had been mistakenly buried alive, and realized that his family believed him to be dead. The mental anguish of that realization, combined with the physical agony of slow suffocation, represents one of the most nightmarish deaths ever documented in medical literature. The discovery of Herbert Prescott's true fate sent shock waves through the medical community, extending far beyond New England. Dr. Blackwood's findings were published in medical journals across Europe and America, fundamentally changing how physicians approached the diagnosis of death. The case became required study in medical schools, not only as an example of diagnostic error, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic isolation. The Prescott family never recovered from the revelation. George, though freed from his nightmares, remained psychologically scarred for life. He never had children, never married, and spent his remaining years obsessively documenting his family's genetic history in an attempt to prevent future tragedies. His handwritten journals, discovered in the ruins of the family homestead in 1923, contain hundreds of pages detailing the mental and physical abnormalities that afflicted each Prescott generation. The family line effectively ended with George's death in 1891. The few remaining Prescott cousins scattered across the country, abandoning the cursed name and attempting to flee their genetic legacy. The homestead in Prescott Hollow was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the Massachusetts wilderness, though locals reported strange phenomena in the area for decades afterward. Unexplained sound from the family cemetery, sightings of figures moving among the overgrown graves, and a persistent feeling of unease that seemed to permeate the very soil. The postmortem photograph of Herbert and his brothers became one of the most studied images in the history of forensic medicine. When examined with modern photographic enhancement techniques, experts have identified subtle signs that Herbert was indeed alive when the picture was taken. The slight tension around his eyes, the barely perceptible color in his skin, and most disturbingly, evidence of muscle tension that would be impossible in a true corpse. Perhaps most chillingly, advanced digital analysis has revealed what appears to be the faintest suggestion of movement in Herbert's fingers during the long exposure required for the 1858 photograph. Some experts suggest this could be explained by natural post-mortem processes, but others believe it represents the last conscious movements of a boy trapped in a living nightmare, unable to signal his desperate need for help. The Herbert Prescott case influenced medical practice for generations. Mandatory waiting periods before burial became standard procedure, and new techniques for confirming death were developed specifically to prevent similar tragedies. The case also contributed to the Victorian era's growing fear of premature burial, spawning an entire industry of safety coffins equipped with breathing tubes, bells, and other devices designed to allow the accidentally buried to signal for help. Modern genetics has confirmed that the Prescott family's condition was likely caused by a combination of rare recessive genes that became concentrated through generations of inbreeding. Similar conditions have been documented in other isolated populations, though none as severe as what the Prescotts experienced. The family's tragic legacy serves as a stark reminder of the biological consequences of genetic isolation and the vital importance of genetic diversity in human populations. Today, the original photograph of the Prescott brothers resides in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, where it continues to disturb researchers and visitors alike. Those who study the image often report feeling an inexplicable sense of unease, as though Herbert's trapped consciousness somehow remains present in the captured moment. Whether this is merely the power of suggestion or something more profound remains a mystery that continues to fascinate those brave enough to look deeply into the eyes of a boy who died twice, once in the world of the living, and once in the darkness beneath the earth where no one could hear him scream. The story of Herbert Prescott reminds us that the most horrifying tales are often not fiction, but the documented realities of our past. Moments when tragedy, ignorance, and genetic misfortune combine to create nightmares that no human being should have to endure. His legacy endures not just in medical textbooks, but as a haunting reminder that sometimes the worst monsters are not supernatural beings, but the limitations of human knowledge and the cruel indifference of fate itself.